The rain drummed softly against the windows of an upscale restaurant, casting a melancholy glow on the city streets outside. Inside, in a dimly lit corner, sat Nicholas Carter, a man whose wealth could buy him anything except the one thing he had lost. His fingers idly traced the rim of his untouched wineglass, his thoughts far away. The world saw him as a self-made millionaire, a titan of industry. But tonight, he was just a grieving man, weighed down by a loss he could never outrun. Across the table, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, played absently with her food, her once bright blue eyes now dull, her spirit as lifeless as the autumn leaves outside. Since the day her mother, Emily, had passed away, Lily had withdrawn into a shell. Nicholas had tried everything, hiring the best therapists, the most expensive caregivers. But nothing worked. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't laugh. It was as if a part of her had died along with Emily. Nicholas let out a weary sigh, running a hand through his thick, disheveled hair. He had built an empire from nothing, yet he was powerless to bring his daughter back to life. And then something happened. A voice, soft, warm, and full of quiet strength, broke through his dark thoughts. "Come on, sweetheart, just one more bite." "Okay." Nicholas's head snapped up. His gaze landed on a waitress crouched beside Lily. She had hazel eyes that carried a kindness he hadn't seen in years, and dark hair tied up in a messy bun. Her uniform was slightly worn, her apron stained from a long shift, but she held herself with an air of warmth that was impossible to ignore. What stunned Nicholas most wasn't her presence. It was Lily. The little girl hesitated. Then, to his utter disbelief, opened her mouth and took a bite. For months, she had refused food, barely consuming anything beyond a few sips of water. Yet now, a complete stranger had done in mere seconds what he had failed to do for years. A strange tightness gripped his chest. He should be furious. No one had the right to approach his daughter like this. But as he watched Lily swallow and give a tiny, almost forgotten smile, he felt something else entirely. Awe, for the first time in years. He wasn't alone in his fight to save his daughter. Nicholas couldn't look away. Lily, his fragile, this broken little girl, had just laughed. It was a small giggle, barely more than a whisper, but it was real, and it had been drawn out by a woman he had never met before. His fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "Who was she?" "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured, yet laced with quiet authority. "What do you think you're doing?" The waitress stood quickly, as if realizing how inappropriate it must have seemed to feed a millionaire's child without permission. Her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep. I just saw that she wasn't eating," and her voice trailed off as she glanced down at Lily, as if searching for the right words. Nicholas studied her. There was something about her. Something familiar, yet completely unknown. She had no reason to care, yet the way she had looked at his daughter, it was as if she understood. Before he could say anything more, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. He turned to see Lily staring up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, please don't be mad at her. She was just helping me." Nicholas inhaled sharply. Lily hadn't spoken much to anyone in 2 years. She had never defended anyone. And yet, here she was, pleading for this stranger. The waitress, her name tag read Sophie, swallowed hard. "I know what it's like to feel alone," she murmured. Nicholas's eyes narrowed. "Alone." She shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the notepad in her hands. "I lost my mother when I was little too," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "And after she was gone, I stopped eating. Nothing tasted good anymore. Nothing felt right. But then someone helped me. Someone showed me that even when everything feels broken, there are still people who care. She turned back to Lily with a gentle smile. Maybe I just wanted to be that person for her. Nicholas's throat tightened. He searched her face for deception, but found none. Only sincerity. Only truth. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than grief. Before he could respond, a rough voice interrupted. Sophie breaks over. A short, balding man in a grease-stained apron, probably the manager, glared at her from across the restaurant. Sophia nodded quickly, stepping away. I'm sorry. I should get back to work. Lily's face fell. Will you come back? Sophie hesitated, then offered a small smile. If I can. Nicholas watched her disappear into the crowd, something gnawing at his chest. She wasn't just a waitress. There was more to her, and for the first time in years, he wanted to know more. He turned back to his untouched meal, but his appetite was gone. His mind, however, was racing. Sophie's words echoed in his head. I know what it's like to feel alone. And for the first time since Emily's death, he wondered, had fate placed this woman in his path for a reason? Days passed, but Nicholas couldn't shake the image of Sophie feeding Lily. It haunted him, lingered in his thoughts, and he found himself returning to the same restaurant. Day after day, each time he would see Sophie, he would watch her closely, her every movement, the way she interacted with customers, the way she interacted with Lily. There was a quiet strength in her that both unsettled and intrigued him. He wasn't the type of man to feel drawn to a woman like her. Sophie wasn't wealthy, she wasn't glamorous, and she wasn't part of his world. But there was something about her, a rawness, a realness, that he hadn't encountered in years. It made him uncomfortable. One evening, as he sat in his usual corner, he watched her rush by, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion she tried to mask as she passed. She noticed him staring and gave him a quick, tight smile before moving on. Nicholas could feel his chest tighten. He had to know more. Who was she really? And why did it feel like fate had placed her in his path? He couldn't stop thinking about it. Just then, a loud crash broke his reverie. Plates shattered on the floor, followed by the sounds of a customer yelling, "Stupid girl, look what you've done." Nicholas shot up from his seat. The rude customer stood over Sophie, his expensive suit now stained by spilled water. Sophie was on her knees, trembling as she scrambled to pick up the pieces of broken dishes. Nicholas's blood boiled. He had seen men like this before, entitled, rude, cruel, but never had he been in such a position to do something about it. Before he even knew what he was doing, he was walking toward them. The entire restaurant had gone quiet, heads turned, as Nicholas's imposing figure approached the scene. The customer's face turned pale as he recognized who was walking toward him. Nicholas Carter, the millionaire! Nicholas folded his arms, his voice cool and collected. Is there a problem here? The man stammered. She spilled water on me. Nicholas glanced down at Sophie, her hands shaking, as she tried to clean up the mess. Something inside him snapped. She should be fired. The man yelled, pointing at her. Nicholas's gaze hardened. For an accident, that's an interesting take, he said, his voice icy. The man hesitated, realizing who he was speaking to, but he was too proud to back down. Nicholas turned his attention to the restaurant manager, who had been standing at the side, watching the exchange. How much does she make per month? The manager stammered. Looking confused, Nicholas took out a stack of bills from his wallet. I'll pay her salary for the next 3 months, he said. And I'll double it if you fire him instead. He pointed to the rude customer, whose face had turned an even deeper shade of red. The restaurant fell silent. The tension thick in the air. Nicholas's offer was impossible to ignore. The manager, sweating, finally gave in. "I think you should leave, sir," he said to the rude customer. The man glared at Nicholas before storming out, muttering curses under his breath. Nicholas let out a slow breath, watching as the tension in the restaurant eased. He turned back to Sophie, who was looking at him with wide eyes. But to his surprise, there was no gratitude in her expression. In fact, she looked furious. Before he could say anything, she grabbed his arm and dragged him into the kitchen, away from prying eyes. The door swung shut behind them. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed, slapping his chest hard. Nicholas blinked, stunned by her sudden outburst. "Excuse me." Her eyes blazed with anger. "You think money fixes everything? You think I needed you to rescue me?" Nicholas opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie wasn't done. "I don't need a rich man throwing money around like he owns the world. I fought my own battles." Her voice was sharp, but there was an undeniable sadness in it. Nicholas stood frozen, his mind racing. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this, not since Emily, and instead of feeling insulted, he found himself intrigued. Before he could respond, the door to the kitchen burst open. A small voice, fragile and weak, called out, "Mommy." Nicholas' heart skipped a beat as he turned to see a little girl, no older than 4, running into Sophie's arms. Sophie immediately scooped the girl up, her entire demeanor changing in an instant. "Cecilia, what are you doing here?" Sophie whispered, her voice full of love and concern. Nicholas stood frozen, watching the interaction. The child in Sophie's arms looked fragile, her small frame barely able to hold her up. She looked sick, and something inside Nicholas twisted. He had seen it. The way Sophie's eyes softened when she held her daughter, the way she spoke to her, the way she cradled her, as if the entire world could crumble and she would still protect that little girl. Sophie wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just some stranger. She was a mother. And just like that, everything clicked for Nicholas. The reason Sophie understood Lily's pain, the reason she had cared so much about a child she barely knew, became painfully clear. Sophie wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for her daughter, just as he had fought for Lily. The realization hit Nicholas like a thunderclap. He had spent so much time wallowing in his own grief, so focused on his own loss, that he had failed to see the struggles of others. Sophie wasn't just working to make ends meet. She was working to save her daughter. Cecilia, he realized, wasn't just a sick child. She was the heart of Sophie's world, the very thing that kept her going when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Nicholas watched as Sophie cradled Cecilia, her face a mixture of exhaustion and love. There was no doubt in his mind that she would do anything to make sure her daughter was safe. She had been fighting battles of her own, silently bearing the weight of her struggles. Sophia's story, her pain, mirrored his own in so many ways. Nicholas had lost Emily, and Sophie had lost her own peace, her own sense of security. In the fight to save her daughter, they had both been trapped in their own battles, unable to move forward. Until now, Nicholas couldn't just sit there anymore. He had to help. He had to do more than just throw money at the problem. It wasn't about the money. It was about making a difference. "Let me help," he said quietly, his voice soft yet full of resolve. Sophia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I understand more than you think," he replied. "I lost my wife, Sophie, and I watched my daughter fade away because I didn't know how to save her. I won't let you go through the same thing." Sophie's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. She simply held Cecilia tighter, as if bracing herself for whatever might come next. Nicholas knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. He couldn't watch Sophie suffer any longer, not when he had the means to help. It wasn't about charity. It was about compassion. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't doing it out of guilt or obligation. He was doing it because he cared. But Sophie wasn't ready to accept help just yet. Her pride, her sense of independence, made it difficult for her to accept what Nicholas was offering. And yet, deep down, she knew that this man, this stranger who had entered her life, wasn't like the others. He wasn't offering help out of pity. He was offering it because he understood. And that was something Sophie couldn't deny. 2 weeks passed since that evening in the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, Nicholas found himself waking up each day with purpose. It wasn't just his work that filled his thoughts now, but Sophie and Cecilia. Every day he had returned to the restaurant, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, to make sure they were okay. But Sophie remained distant, polite, and distant as ever, never allowing herself to lean on anyone. Nicholas knew he couldn't force her to accept his help, but he also knew that he couldn't sit idly by while she continued to carry such a heavy burden on her own. One morning, he found himself standing outside a modest building. Sophie's apartment. He had spent the past few days tracking down her address, knowing that the next step would be to offer her a chance to rebuild her life. Not just for Cecilia's sake, but for her own as well. The rain was falling gently, and the streets were quieter than usual. Nicholas took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and there she stood. Sophie's tired eyes, her face lined with exhaustion. "Nicholas," she said, her voice cautious but not unkind. "I know you're not ready for this." "Sophie," Nicholas began, his voice steady. "But I can't watch you struggle anymore. Let me help. Let me take you and Cecilia to the best doctors. I've seen too much pain, too much loss. I know what it's like to feel helpless, to wish for a second chance." Sophie's gaze softened for a moment, but then her walls came back up. "I don't need your pity. Nicholas, I've been through worse than you can imagine. You can't just buy your way into my life." "I'm not offering money," he replied, his tone sincere. "I'm offering a chance for you and Cecilia to have the life you deserve." For a long moment, Sophie remained silent. Her eyes darted between Nicholas and the small apartment behind her. She was torn. Her pride fought against her desire for a better life, for the life she and her daughter both deserved. Finally, she let out a long breath. "I've spent so long trying to do everything on my own. Maybe it's time to let someone else in." Nicholas smiled softly, the tension easing from his body. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Sophie. Neither of you do." Weeks later, Cecilia was admitted to one of the best pediatric hospitals in the country. Nicholas had arranged for her to receive treatment from world-renowned specialists, ensuring every possible measure was taken for her care. The process was long, exhausting, and filled with uncertainty. But Sophie was no longer alone. She had Nicholas's support, and, more importantly, her trust in him began to grow. Sophie was amazed at how little Nicholas had asked for in return. He had helped her, not out of obligation or pity, but because he truly cared. And for the first time in years, Sophie began to believe that someone could love her and Cecilia without strings attached. The day of the surgery arrived, and the waiting room felt like an eternity. Nicholas, ever the calm presence, sat beside Sophie, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The tension in the air was palpable, but Sophie could feel a quiet sense of hope that hadn't been there before. When the doctor finally emerged, his smile told them everything they needed to know. "She's going to be just fine," the doctor said, and Sophie collapsed into Nicholas's arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. 1 year later, on a warm, sunny day, Lily and Cecilia were running through the garden, giggling and playing, their laughter filling the air. It was a sound that had been absent from both of their lives for far too long. Nicholas and Sophie stood side by side, watching their daughters with tears in their eyes. There was a sense of peace between them now, an unspoken understanding that they had found something worth fighting for. Nicholas had healed, not just because of the success of Cecilia's treatment, but because he had learned to open his heart again. Sophie, too, had found healing, not just in the medical care Nicholas had provided, but in the kindness he had shown her. "I never thought I could feel this way again," Sophie said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "You didn't just save Cecilia, Nicholas. You saved me too." Nicholas turned to her, his eyes soft. "You were never really lost, Sophie. You just needed someone to remind you of what you were worth." Sophie smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "And you've done that." Nicholas took a deep breath, the weight of the past finally lifting. "I don't want to be just someone who helped you once. I wanted to be in your life, in Cecilia's life, for as long as you'll let me." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up to gently touch his face. "You already are," she whispered. And in that moment, Nicholas knew that everything had changed. His heart, once filled with the pain of loss, was now full of hope and love. It wasn't just the story of a man and a woman finding each other. It was the story of two people who had suffered, who had learned the true meaning of healing and redemption, and who had come together to create something new, a family. And as the sun set over the garden, Nicholas finally understood what it meant to truly live again.